On the first night Julie laid eyes upon the shadowy chicken man, there was a steady downpour. The figure, who was distant enough to seem beetle-like to Julie's eye, lurched steadily towards her family's barn. The chicken man would appear on every night of a full moon, and walk into that very barn where the animals were kept. Julie would grow up and watch this mysterious man in awe, making sure to look at the barn from the living room window almost every full moon. The barn stood firmly in the prairie countryside, casting a large shadow into the night, casting awe upon Julie as she would gaze at it. 12:15, 12:30. That was the chicken man's time, and he would stroll into the looming barn, disappearing into its large shadow in that time. Julie's straight-edged traditional parents, who grew well into the gray hair phase, supposed there would be a time they would have to explain everything to their youngest child. Julie always was an energetic, curious kid after all. Her first bout of questions came as no surprise at all, during a pancake breakfast on her 9th birthday. Dad, I almost went out there last night," Julie exclaimed, covered in a mess of wrapping paper. Maple syrup appeared to be knotting her golden blonde hair. Julie's father almost dropped his fork. It was not the fact that she knew about the chicken man or was asking questions that scared him, but the specific statement she made. "Don't talk to him, Julie." Julie's father sat in a rut of thought for a moment, thinking of ways to ward his daughter off from a confrontation. "He's not a nice fellow. He don't want to be bothered, you hear?" he lectured, now having a finger pointed at Julie. The mother of the family sat silently next to her husband, hoping, worrying that he was careful in his explanation. Down at the further end, Julie's two older brothers sat looking at each other, mischievously grinning. They already knew of the chicken man, they have heard this talk before. "Don't you want to know why they call him the chicken man, sis?" hissed Ryan, the middle child of the family. Now the family sat in silence, with the oldest brother Charles beginning to act in a cool, disinterested manner. He poked at his mashed potatoes, with his fork as his sword as his father watched uncomfortably. Just as the old man opened his mouth to begin speaking, Julie exclaimed, "Because he takes the chickens. That's why." Julie's father dropped his fork again, this time it fell all the way to the ground rather than onto his plate. A loud and dramatic fall, to accommodate the sudden shock in the old man's head. His daughter was smarter than he realized, and he supposed it was about time he had a child who showed early signs of brightness. He slowly turned to his daughter with the expression of intrigue stuck to his face. "How'd you know that, Julie?" He turned and looked at his wife, who upon immediate notice began to shake her head at him, "Because every time before he comes, you put chickens in there and then they're gone the next day." Julie rambled excitedly. "In July, you put Ruffles, mustard, and one of the brown chickies in there, and the next day they were gone." Julie now seemed to be upset, her tone of voice carried an air of accusation. And in September you put Sunshine, Peckington, and Goobly in there, and they were gone the next day. Where did they go, Dad? Does the chicken man take them somewhere nice?" Julie's father sighed, putting one hand in his face, and the other almost accidentally in his mashed potatoes. He had told Julie before about naming the chickens, and sure, he guessed the chickens were going to a nicer place. Most people referred to heaven as that, such as when his dog passed as a kid, and his mother would say, "She's in a better place now, son." Nonetheless, the fear of his daughter eventually seeking to confront the chicken man lurked in the back of his mind. He supposed he would have to think of a better explanation. A better explanation, when there's time. The old man thought, staring into a picture frame on the dining room wall. Covered in morning sunlight, the father, holding back tears, stared into his lost firstborn son's eyes, solidified by the glass covering his picture. Yes, he has known the chicken man all too well. He was not going to let Julie go down that same dreadful path, the one that he watched before she was born, still terrifying his frail mind to this day. "Yes, they go to a better place, honey. Don't worry about it," the old man said softly, still gazing into the photograph which only served as a reminder of dark days. Outside the mist of thought clouding his brain, he heard his daughter blurting out questions machine gun style, with all of them flying right out the window rather than into his ear. "Dad, Dad, did you hear me?" His daughter kept asking, probing for his attention. Her father turned to look at her slowly, just coming back to now. "What now?" he asked. "Why does he come at the same time? Between 12:15 and 12:30? Julie's father sighed, he could feel his brain going back into a depressive haze now. "One last time that morning," he replied, "because that's his time, Julie. That's his schedule." And that was the last talk of the Chicken Man that morning, and for quite some time during Julie's adolescent years, her peak interest shone through as a love for animals. She had gotten a puppy for her 10th birthday, a border collie named Peaches. She and Peaches loved to roam the prairies surrounding the farm. The old man would go on to buy some new friends for Julie, or farm animals as he so thought to call them. Julie and Peaches went on to befriend all of them, from the new goats, to the rabbits, to the cow who she named Sadie. Julie grew up as an outcast in her small countryside school district. She did not do well making friends with humans, discovering that animals made for much more understanding companions. As she gave her heart to the animals, feeling affection from them as well, it was not long before another thought popped into her head around the time she was 13. A natural thought for an animal lover to have. Thoughts of veganism. She knew her parents would be initially shocked when she turned down her first plate of boiled chicken, and they would maybe even refuse to accommodate her new diet, as stubborn and traditional as they were. She also knew her older brothers Ryan, who was 15 then, and Charles who was 16 would never let up on the vegan jokes. Regardless, Julie would go on to shrug all of this off. Her parents did refuse to feed her for a while, so she lived off of salad. After about a month, they began to accommodate, realizing this may not just be a phase. Her brothers of course began their onslaught of vegan-targeted bullying, but they got tired of it after about 2 weeks. Julie lived as a flower child. Her days were full of roaming the prairie farmland with Peaches, laughing into the wind, filling her head with childhood memories anyone would hope to never forget. Yep, it was all roses, except for one dark corner of her mind that never went away. That mysterious figure, the Chicken Man, who came every full moon, and snatched her friends, her chickens. That barn always carried a mysterious air to her, and despite trying to stay out of it as much as possible during her adolescence, she went on to watch that barn at night. Almost every full moon, she would be perched on the couch, looking out the window as the dark, round figure strutted with grim ease and lethargicness towards the barn. Rain, hail, lightning storms, it did not matter. If there was a full moon, the Chicken Man would come during his time. Her memories of the Chicken Man always gave her a childlike sense of mystery that lurked on the family's farm. She wouldn't mind watching that ghoul come every full moon for the rest of her life, if it were not for one thing that Julie could not get over. The chickens, her friends that would disappear. Julie cared about them too much, and as her love for animals grew, and she began to develop a career interest in being a veterinarian, Julie knew she had to find out where the chickens were going. So she hatched a plan that would oppose the words her father had lectured to her on her 9th birthday. It was a cold night in November, winds were roaring atop the flat prairie land. There was no rain on this night, only a full moon. Tonight, Julie would seek redemption, or at least understanding. Her father had told her that the chickens went to a better place, but she was old enough at this point to understand what the geyser meant. Being 15 came with all sorts of grim understandings, perhaps the first thoughts of a potential afterlife, and what in the world that could possibly be. For Julie, the age also came with a new sense of courage, which allowed her to take action in her plan. She would not directly confront the Chicken Man, as she honestly assumed her worst fears to be true. The Chicken Man was likely dangerous. This was not a confirmed likelihood, but Julie tended to fear the worst. Growing up a social outcast does that to people, and she had no shortage of anxiety. Rather, Julie would watch and wait until the Chicken Man's time was over, and it would become her time. As the Chicken Man was leaving, Julie planned to watch him in an effort to observe the condition of the chickens. Were they slung in a burlap sack, writhing in pain as they struggled for space with one another, or were they gently placed in grates? Julie hoped for the latter. She sat on the couch with a bag of vegan crackers, waiting in the night for the Chicken Man's time as she ran through possible scenarios in her head. The Chicken Man ran 7 minutes late that night, which was unusual to Julie, who has kept track of this most of her life. Her pupils shone in the moonlight as she sat in a dreamy gaze on the couch. She now could see the dark figure of the Chicken Man, who always seemed to be in a dreary, zombie-like state of limping. He lurched slowly across the flat prairie ground, and Julie could always observe him for about 3 minutes until he finally dissipated under the giant, looming shadow of the barn. Just barely, his round outline could be seen entering the doors to the barn. Julie shuddered watching him, and somehow she got a better look at his figure than she ever had. He seemed abnormally round in both the face and the torso. It did not look normal for a normal human being, and his large head seemed to come naturally with a hunchback. Once again, Julie shuddered as new nightmarish images manifested in her mind. Julie sat in an anxious rut, waiting to watch the Chicken Man leave. She now felt scared of what could happen if she was spotted. This man, who was shown to be misshapen and deformed, could take rather violent action upon discovery of her actions. Casting aside all anxiety momentarily, Julie reassured herself of her mission: to protect all living things, as they were all created equal. If she ever joined PETA like she planned to one day, she would tell them about her courageous chicken rescue story. Just as the clock struck 12:29, the Chicken Man slowly limped out of the barn, beginning to make his leave. Julie studied him as hard as she could from just the sight of the window. He did not appear to be carrying anything. Having her final thoughts of animal rescue stories at PETA fundraising lunches, she stood up with courage. This Chicken Man required further investigation. Julie grabbed one item silently out of a kitchen drawer, a flashlight, which she knew to be rather dim. She slid on some green flower flip-flops, and slowly, quietly opened the back door. Ever so gently, Julie slid the back door shut, and realized her hands were trembling. Julie knew it was obviously fear that coursed through her veins. She suddenly realized she had no current sight on the Chicken Man, and he could be right behind her, waiting to take her to that better place that her father mentioned. Once she swallowed her fear momentarily once again, and began to creep across the field slowly, she gazed up into the starry clear sky. She has wished for rain then and there, that it may conceal her efforts. However, it was just her and the wind that blew her blonde hair in the night. Julie crept around the backside of the barn. She planned to come around the side and be behind the Chicken Man's vector of movement. Then, she could observe unseen. She executed her move around the barn, sticking close to its tan wooden walls, feeling mud squeezing between her toes. Upon turning the final corner, Julie was almost in front of the barn. She decided to hang by the corner in case the Chicken Man were to suddenly turn around. The corner would provide her with a sense of escape, which gave her the final grace of courage to look forward into the night, giving her the best view of the cryptid man she has ever had. The Chicken Man was even rounder than she thought, even more deformed than she could imagine. His head was almost as big as his torso, with both body parts being the shape of an oblong oval. This was one plump man. Secondly, Julie noticed that the Chicken Man was dressed rather formally, in a slovenly homeless type of way. He wore a dusty old suit jacket and suit pants, which Julie could just make out to be light brown amidst the darkness. He also had on a normal-sized fedora, which seemed way too small for his abnormally large head. This ghoul appeared to Julie as a homeless man begging for money in a ragged suit, as if to create the illusion that he might actually be wealthy. The final thing she noticed, or rather did not see at all, was captive chickens. They were nowhere in sight. There was one thing visibly carried by the Chicken Man, and it explained his limp stride in full. A traditional cane, curved, full of wood chips and all. No burlap sack, no crates, no chickens. At all. It struck a concerning and fearful thought into Julie's mind, as she stood trembling, clutching the corner of the barn. Are the chickens dead in there? Did he kill my friends? Julie suddenly grew antsy to check in the barn, but she was smarter than that. She could not make a move towards the front of the barn, where the doors were located, for she would be easily visible if the chicken man were to. Julie shrugged the anxiety away once more. She took deep breaths and watched the chicken man's back grow smaller and smaller, his faded suit less and less visible. Finally, like a mirage fading away, darkness enveloped the monstrous figure of the chicken man, and the farm's age-old mystery had disappeared into the darkness once again. He would be back in a full lunar cycle. Hesitation did not hold back the young girl, and she dashed through the barn doors, which were left ajar by the chicken man. She would ask herself if he always did that, but rather her mind was on the lives of her beloved fowl friends. The chicken man did not have them, therefore two possibilities existed in Julie's mind. The chickens were dead in the barn, or alive. A classical Schrödinger's cat scenario, at least for the single moment of anticipation. What Julie saw, however, defied the possibilities for any logical scenario of such sorts. There were no chickens to be seen. Julie, who stood frozen in confusion, then began a visual scan of the room. Fallen feathers, knocked over buckets, and blood stained the hay. Lots of blood. No chickens, but enough red to serve as a velvet walkway. Racing thoughts scoured the jam-packed highway that ranged across Julie's mind, but answers were not among those thoughts. What could possibly have happened to those chickens? Julie paced the barn, examining the feathers, and the buckets, and the blood. She held back tears, for all her common sense confirmed what anyone would know, that sprawl of gore was from the chickens. Julie shifted slowly towards the barn doors in a daze. She kneeled down in a whimpering fright, before she was shocked by beams of sudden light. Across the dark shrouded prairie, she noticed the light pop on in her kitchen out of the corner of her eye. Natural instinct, which Julie preferred to follow, would tell her to hide outside until whoever was up would return to bed. No one possibly knew she was out here, unless they checked her empty bed, which she assumed was unlikely. In the midst of rational thought, however, her emotions swelled up in her. Violently, like a volcano erupting, Julie suddenly took action upon her emotions. She had hoped the person in the kitchen was her father, and she was going to demand answers for this murder. Her father never thought much of animals. Julie noticed he looked at them with dollar signs in his eyes. It always disgusted her, and she was finally going to yell some sense into him, even if it awoke her two dimwit siblings. After a series of angry steps across the mud-filled farm field, Julie opened the unlocked back door, with no hesitation or sense of subtlety at all. Immediately, her father turned around with a sense of alarm, almost dropping the ice cream he had banded from the fridge. As Julie stood in the doorway, huffing and puffing with rage fueled from the questions she would be demanding answers for, her father stood staring at her with an expression as blank as Julie was furious. Suddenly, the man in her father's head took a stand as the realization came to him, what night it was, her daughter being outside, the time that has just passed on the clock. Julie, what did I tell you all these years? Julie's father shrieked as he walked towards her, not giving a damn about rousing anyone in the household. What did you do, Julie? What did you just do? The old, fearful man's hands now gripped his daughter's shoulders tightly. Fear of what may have just happened cancelled any logical thought from occurring, and he only demanded answers. He gripped his daughter as tightly as a tug of war, with his eyes in a demanding and horrified glare, almost popping out of his head. Julie rebelliously slapped her father's hands, but his grip was too firm to remove them. Finally, she ceased her struggle, and looked furiously into her father's worrisome eyes. What happened? What happened to those chickens? Julie began to tremble, and began her struggle against her father's cold, steel grip once again. There was blood. Blood. Blood everywhere. Daddy, they're dead. Julie stopped her struggle once more, and suddenly anger and confusion became tears and sorrow. Julie's knees became weak, and she began to fall slowly to the ground. Upon seeing the distraught state of his daughter, the old man let up a bit, releasing his stone-cold grip. Julie's back slid down the nearest kitchen wall, and balled up in a downpour of tears. Honey, the old man said sympathetically, yet still with an undertone of strictness, "Please, those chickens had to go. Julie, just please don't ask a lot of questions." Upon hearing her father's pleas, the volcano of emotions boiled once more, slowly rising up, and up, until they swelled in her head, lava pouring out her ears. With a burst of anger, Julie yelled in a sorrowful rage, "Answer for the chickens." Immediately, she thrust her elbow back with every intention of banging the nearest wall, making a demanding statement to her father. The elbow thrust seemed to almost shake the entire house, if not just that damn wall. In the next moment, Julie was greeted by a sharp pain to the head. She was so woozy, the sound of glass shattering on the floor dangerously close to her did not even strike her ears. She did however notice the pale gasping expression on her father's face as he dropped immediately to his knees next to her. To her surprise, her father seemed to be in tears, not over her injury, but over whatever item lay on the ground. It was a picture of the brother Julie never met, the long-lost first son, Theodore. Julie stood up slowly, and it seemed that the blow to her head rerouted her mood strings completely. She gazed down at her father, seeing he was whimpering, grasping the picture in his hands. His hand bled, running thick blood down his arm. The old man was in a state of intense grief however, and did not seem to care one bit. Julie kept opening her mouth to speak multiple times, but the desperate state that she was seeing her strong-willed father in for the first time kept her mouth shut. Now in the brief moment of awkward grieving, her mind began to loosely throw pieces together in a concoction that may make sense. "Dad," Julie muttered shamefully. There was no reply from her father, just the silent, constant weep of a defeated old man. "Dad." She went about once more. One more time, there was no reply, and she suddenly grew impatient despite the sorrowful atmosphere. "Dad." She now pronounced firmly, being sure to grab his attention. Her father still said nothing, but she at least got a look from him, as he slowly turned his droopy face towards her. With her father on his knees before her, she had a sense of being the bigger human, and gained a sense of vindication. "Dad. I know you don't like to talk about Theo." The expression on her father's face turned from one of pure sorrow to a stone-cold stare. He truly did not like talking about Theo. "You never talk about him, and neither does Charlie. Whenever I ask him, he gets mean and fights me off," Julie said, maintaining her temporary strong will. Does his death, and the chicken man?" Julie was now losing that confidence as the look on her father's face became one of someone who was about to commit murder. Nonetheless, she forced her question out of her throat in a coarse mutter. "Do they have something to do with each other?" Julie's father not only looked, but truly was in that moment, defeated. His face dropped down, not uttering a word. Julie stood there, seeing the state of discomfort her words had put her father in. It made her uncomfortable as well. This period of awkwardness was brief however, and her father suddenly looked up, with a shrill glare coming from his now serious eyes. "Bedtime. Go. Go to bed. Now." He got up, and once again wrapped a stone-cold grip around his daughter's shoulders. Blood stained Julie's shirt. He was once again the bigger man now. "Let's go. Let's go. Bedtime." Julie struggled. She hadn't had bedtime since she was about 12, and this sudden imposing of authority irked her. As she felt the grip get harder and her father getting more serious and sinister in his demands, she finally lashed out with one more rebellious slap. "Okay, fine, I'm going," she said, accepting defeat. Julie stomped up the stairs to her bedroom, the sight of chicken blood and her defeated father lingering on her mind. She would not receive answers to her questions tonight. Julie's relationship with her father was unsteady for that entire lunar cycle. They had barely made eye contact at the dining table anymore. The mother had noticed this, but knew better than to ask her husband questions involving such matters. The dimwit brothers Ryan and Charlie noticed as well, but as if they cared, questions pestered the mind of Julie for that time, poking at it, causing little bouts of insanity. Her anxiety was really getting the best of her, and she could look in the mirror and tell she has not been herself as of late. It was not until one cold December day, she would have her question partially answered. Every now and then, Charlie and Julie would hike through the nearby fields. In the summer, these fields would be ripe with corn and vegetation of all varieties. She had noticed her parents' farm had become increasingly bountiful throughout her adolescence, growing taller corn each year. However, it was just bare fields for the prairie land during December, but the chats Julie had with her brother on these hikes made it worth all the while to her. Charlie was a reserved, yet tough character, and Julie rarely had a chance to talk with him one-on-one. Peaches would come on the walk with them, but she would not really count as part of the conversation, would she? Julie would also invite Ryan to come, but he would be nose-deep in the latest comic book he has obtained as usual. Julie had followed closely behind her tall, oldest brother as the sun set on the prairie horizon. Peaches wandered off nearby, but would follow them when she noticed she was getting far enough. Julie admired her oldest brother. He was always the first volunteer when Papa needed a farm hand. She always admired his muscles, gleaming in sweat under the sun as he chopped wood on a hot summer day. Julie could usually go and talk to him about anything, except for that one thing. Theodore. It is true, Charlie's reaction upon even hearing the mention of his dead older brother's name was one of disgust. He was an escape artist when it came to backing out of these kinds of conversations. However, there they were, brother, sister, and dog alone in the prairie fields that sunset. It was now or never for these kinds of questions that I and the most unusual moment, however, right as Julie opened her mouth to utter menacing mentions of Theodore to her oldest brother, Charlie looked dead at her and said something that held shocking relevance in her mind: he ate them. Charlie said with a mischievous grin on his face. Julie gave Charlie a confused gaze. Wha? Who ate what? She asked, somehow knowing what this was about in the dark depths of her fragile mind. After a momentary chuckle, Charlie met his sister's gaze. The Chicken Man, I know you know about him. Charlie said reassuringly. He ate the chickens. I heard you screaming at Dad a couple weeks ago. It was all making sense in a horrifying way that Charlie perhaps did not intend to Julie. You guys ain't good at keeping quiet like that. Julie stopped walking. Disturbing images flooded her mind. The blood. The feathers. The round, misshapen, disturbing figure that limped zombie-like into their barn every full moon. More so, she was extremely surprised Charlie had made mention of the Chicken Man so suddenly. Julie was wrong before. If there was any time to ask questions, now surely this was the time right here. Julie muttered, and then swallowed. He ate them. Yep. Charlie replied, not seeming to give a damn about animal life at all. He ate them. Julie wanted to puke for a second. She knew she had to regain her composure, however, there were important questions to be asked. After glancing at Peaches to make sure she was in range, she then looked at her brother, horrified by the realization. Why? She muttered, holding back tears provoked by images of her sweet friends being devoured by that fat homeless-looking character. Why would anyone do that? She was now growing angry, seeking redemption for the fallen fowls. Charlie sighed and looked up at the stars, which were slowly beginning to fill the sky. Moral dispute filled his mind, and he debated whether to tell his sister what she would eventually find out anyways. Either way, she was growing too curious for her own good. Charlie knew about her sneaking out that night. He had heard the entire conversation between Julie and their dad. With a clear mind, and knowing what needed to be done, Charlie looked at his sister and asked, "Welp, you ready to hear some crazy shit?" Julie stared at her brother blankly, nodding her head, eager to have her many questions answered. Charlie lowered down to his knees, and put forth a hand motion urging Julie to join him. So she did, and Julie crouched down, ready for her brother to spin her a tale as he used to do when she was very young. However, this tale was far more grim, and far more serious. Charlie's face turned ice cold as he began his dark story. So way before you were born, and I think I was like a really little kid, Dad made a deal with the Chicken Man. Charlie now had Julie's full attention, and she was ready to make a grab at any pieces that could help her finish the puzzle. Our farm wasn't doing well for a long time. We couldn't grow anything, and Dad said we got screwed over with the soil. There was radon contamination, or something like that. Either way, we weren't growing jack shit, and we weren't making jack shit for money either. Charlie swallowed and paused for a grim, brief moment before continuing. Dad said this guy came onto the farm in the middle of the night. Right as he was looking for ways out, ways to sell the farm and make a new living, this weird guy comes knocking on the door in the dead of night. Somehow, he knew the situation we were in. He could tell the farm was failing, and could see the low quality of the very few crops we did have growing. This weird guy claimed to have some sort of power, said he wasn't from around here, and told Dad he wanted to make a deal. None of the local restaurants would accept business from the freak show because, well, he was a freak show. So this guy was hungry all the time, he had nowhere to eat. So he eats the chickens. Dad lets him eat the chickens. Julie interrupted hastily, let me finish, sis. Charlie said calmly in an effort to bring his sister down a bit. The deal they made was, that if Dad left him 3 chickens on the night of each full moon, that this guy would bless the land, and we would grow hella crops. Like, a shit ton. Charlie paused for a moment. And it worked, I guess. It fucking worked.